On the cold, moonless night of April 14th, 1912, the majestic RMS Titanic, deemed unsinkable by its creators and celebrated across the world as a marvel of engineering, struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The collision ripped open its starboard side below the waterline, dooming the massive ocean liner on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. Within less than 3 hours, the largest passenger ship of its time had slipped beneath the waves, claiming over 1,500 lives. Panic, disbelief, and chaos rippled through the icy air as lifeboats were lowered half empty, flares were fired skyward, and desperate calls for help echoed across the ocean. Many remember the Titanic for its grandeur, the class divisions on board, and the courage displayed by some of its passengers. But what is often overlooked is the eerie presence of other ships nearby, floating on the same dark sea, under the same dark sea, each presented with the same cold test. Among them, the ship Samson stands out not for what it did, but for what it failed to do. Its absence in the rescue efforts, despite its proximity, remains one of the most controversial and sobering footnotes in Titanic's tragic legacy. The Samson was a Norwegian sealing ship, relatively small and unassuming compared to giants like the Titanic. While its official logs were scant, anecdotal evidence and later testimonies suggest it was engaged in illegal seal hunting during the night Titanic sank. Samson's crew, fearing the consequences of being caught by maritime authorities, was operating covertly, violating international fishing laws and skirting patrol areas with care. That night, Samson is believed to have been a mere 7 to 10 miles from the Titanic when the great ship sent its first flares into the sky, pleas for help in the form of white rockets, universally understood as a call of dire emergency at sea. But rather than turning toward the light and sound of distress, the Samson's crew made the haunting choice to turn away. They fled into the night, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable desperation and terror. Their motivations were simple, yet devastating in implication. They feared exposure. If authorities spotted them near the disaster zone, their illegal activities could be discovered. Fines, imprisonment, the impounding of their ship all loomed as possibilities. And so, in that moment, self-preservation triumphed over moral obligation. The choice, while logical from a selfish standpoint, etched their ship's name into the moral graveyard of history. Survivor reports and inquiries later referenced ships seen in the distance during the Titanic's sinking. Some described lights, shadows, or movements on the horizon, ships that never came to help. Among these ships, Samson was often mentioned posthumously, though its exact identification was debated for years. Its crew never officially reported their presence near Titanic, but many in the maritime world believed they were nearby. According to later accounts by some of its crew members given decades after the fact, Samson's sailors witnessed white rockets lighting up the night sky and even heard cries drifting across the icy sea. But paralyzed by the fear of legal consequences, they decided against investigating. Instead, they extinguished their own lights and moved away from the flare-lit scene, disappearing into the darkness. The silence of their departure speaks louder than any sound. They became ghosts on the ocean, witnesses who refused to act. It is important to note that during the Titanic disaster, other ships farther away would race to help. The Carpathia, 68 miles off, navigated through ice fields at full speed to reach the survivors. The Californian, 14 miles away, would later be heavily criticized for not responding adequately. But Samson, closer than any other, remained silent, hidden, and absent. It is easy, from the safety of historical distance, to condemn the actions of the Samson's crew. But understanding their mindset also invites a deeper examination of human nature. They were not hardened criminals or overt villains. They were men trying to make a living in a harsh industry, bending the law in pursuit of profit. Their decision that night was one made under pressure, driven by fear, but that fear cost the lives of potentially hundreds. The moral cowardice lies not simply in turning away, but in doing so while witnessing suffering, seeing rockets fired and hearing human cries, yet still choosing silence. Their moral compass was not broken, it was overridden by self-interest. This failure isn't unique to Samson, it is a universal human flaw, one that reemerges in many contexts. How often do we as individuals or societies choose the path of least resistance when confronted with suffering we could alleviate? Samson's choice illustrates that sometimes the most defining moments of a person or a ship come not from what they did, but from what they refused to do. For decades, historians and researchers debated whether Samson was truly the mystery ship spotted near Titanic. The Californian was long blamed for its inaction, with its captain, Stanley Lord, facing harsh scrutiny during the British and American inquiries. But new testimonies in the 1960s and 1970s reopened the debate, pointing to the possibility that another ship, likely the Samson, was closer and chose to flee. A 1962 interview with Hendrik Nice, a former Samson crewman, revealed chilling details. Nice claimed they saw the rockets and even heard voices. His confession lent credence to the theory that another ship had been nearby. and consciously evaded involvement. While this didn't absolve the Californian of its own failings, it suggested that the closest potential savior was even more culpable and had entirely escaped public reckoning. Yet the lack of formal logs, the delayed testimonies, and the murky legal status of the Samson prevented it from becoming a centerpiece in official Titanic narratives. As a result, its story remained more a whispered legend than a documented fact, one more ghost in the already haunted history of that night. Beyond history, the tale of the Samson has taken on metaphorical power. It has come to symbolize the bystander, the one who sees suffering and walks away. In literature, sermons, ethical studies, and moral allegories, Samson stands in for the individual or institution that chooses silence, that prioritizes reputation or safety over compassion. We see the Samson figure in everyday life, the person who witnesses bullying and stays quiet, the corporation that turns a blind eye to injustice, the neighbor who hears cries of help but fears becoming involved. The ship's dark silhouette against the horizon becomes a reflection of our own inner conflicts, the pull between what is right and what is easy. This symbolic weight transforms Samson from a historical footnote into a moral parable. It invites us to ask, when the flares go up, when the cries are heard, what will we do? Will we sail toward the suffering or away from it? The night of April 14th, 1912, was silent and still in the North Atlantic. A clear sky stretched overhead, strewn with stars, while the sea lay calm and deceptive beneath it. The air, however, was bitterly cold. Floating 14 miles from where the grand RMS Titanic would strike an iceberg and descend into history's most infamous maritime disaster, the SS Californian sat still among the ice. A modest cargo and passenger ship of the Leyland Line, the Californian lacked the grandeur of the Titanic. That night, its mission was simple: to wait for daylight before safely continuing through the treacherous field icebergs that surrounded it. Its engines were stopped, its wireless operator had turned in for the night. Its captain, Stanley Lord, unaware of the unfolding nightmare not far off, lay in bed as rockets illuminated the sky. But this was not merely a case of ignorance or bad timing. The story of the Californian became the focus of a decades-long controversy, a chilling case study in the ethics of hesitation, misjudgment, and the human tendency to defer compassion until conditions feel comfortable. The Californian, more than any other ship that night, came to represent a bystander with the power to help but who chose not to. On board the Californian that night, Third Officer Herbert Stone spotted strange white rockets being fired from a ship on the horizon around 12:45 a.m. He immediately reported them to the captain's cabin. Captain Lord, already aware that a large passenger liner had been making its way through the area earlier in the evening, was informed of the signals, yet he did not instruct any meaningful action. Instead, the captain asked how many rockets had been seen. He was told 5. His response: keep watching them. The officers and crew of the Californian continued to observe the flares for over an hour, but no effort was made to signal back, attempt radio communication. The radio operator had gone to bed shortly before the binary or set course toward the source. At that moment, only 14 miles away, more than 2,200 souls were caught in a nightmare of panic and desperation. The Titanic was dying, and with it, hundreds of men, women, and children were being thrown into the frigid sea. Yet aboard the Californian, life moved quietly. Officers kept their vigil. No one sounded the alarm. The engine room remained silent. Time passed, and so did opportunity. Captain Stanley Lord's later defense was rooted in prudence. Surrounded by dangerous icebergs, it would have been reckless to navigate through the night, he claimed. His reasoning was grounded in safety protocol. Darkness and ice do not mix. With no moon and the risk of collision high, Lord insisted that he could not endanger his ship and crew. To some extent, this reasoning makes practical sense. The Titanic itself had just proven how deadly such navigation could be. The night was full of invisible killers, icebergs lurking silently in the dark. But the moral dilemma at the heart of the Californian's inaction is not about whether Lord feared ice, it's about the weight he gave that fear in comparison to human lives. Had the Californian attempted to push forward slowly, or at least reactivated its wireless to send messages or inquire about the distress rockets, it might have reached Titanic within an hour or two. It could have rescued hundreds still afloat in lifeboats. Instead, the decision was made to do nothing until daylight. By 4 a.m., the Californian resumed wireless contact and learned the horrifying truth. The Titanic had sunk, its lights extinguished, its cries faded. Over 1,500 people had perished, and they had been close enough to witness it without truly seeing it. In the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, both British and American authorities launched formal inquiries. Captain Lord was summoned to testify. He maintained throughout that he did not know the distress rockets were a sign of real danger, and that he had no certainty that the ship seen in the distance was the Titanic. But the testimonies of crew members painted a picture of detachment, misjudgment, and indifference. Lord was accused of failing in his duty of care. His reputation was irrevocably damaged. He never again captained a ship and spent the rest of his life attempting to clear his name. Yet the damage was done not only to his career, but to the moral perception of the Californian itself. The ship became a symbol of preventable loss, a cautionary tale of how caution itself can become cruelty when exercised at the wrong time. The tale of the Californian does not merely belong to maritime history. It stands as a moral allegory with profound implications. This ship represents conditional compassion, the willingness to help only when it is easy, safe, or convenient. It mirrors the many people in our world who say, "I'll help but not if it costs me anything." In schools, offices, governments, and families, we see the Californian attitude at work. It is the person who sees bullying but walks away because they might get in trouble. It is the organization that sees suffering but fears the risk of involvement. It is the individual who sees injustice but waits for a better time to speak. The ship's failure was not technological but spiritual. It did not lack equipment, proximity, or crew. It lacked urgency. It lacked empathy strong enough to overcome fear. The Californian had everything it needed to save lives but lacked the will. But the world's greatest tragedies often unfold while we are waiting for things to be easier. The Californian teaches us that waiting for comfort can cost lives, that action delayed is sometimes action denied. Historians have debated whether the Californian could have actually saved more lives had it acted in time. According to some estimates, had it moved toward the Titanic immediately upon seeing the first rockets, it could have arrived within 90 minutes just before the ship sank. Even if the ship Bukater arrived in time to Bukater to sink it in, it could have rescued many of the passengers still alive in the water or waiting in lifeboats. Instead, the rescue fell entirely to the Carpathia, a ship 68 miles away that raced to the scene at full speed and arrived around 4:mad only to find a sea filled with corpses and a few dozen lifeboats. The contrast between the Carpathia and the Californian, one choosing risk in service of others, the other choosing safety at the cost of others, draws a vivid line between heroism and hesitation. The SS Californian has, over the decades, become an icon of missed opportunity. It is taught in ethics courses, written into novels, featured in documentaries, and whispered about in debates on duty and responsibility. While Stanley Lord's defenders continue to argue that he was scapegoated, the broader lesson remains: inaction has consequences just as grave as action. The ship's name is forever linked not with what it did, but with what it failed to do. It reminds us that neutrality in the face of emergency is not neutrality at all. It is a decision, and often a deadly one. Today, the story of the Californian feels more relevant than ever. In a world filled with crises, climate change, humanitarian disasters, inequality, injustice, we see many Californians, individuals and institutions that see the flares but refuse to move. Their reasoning varies. It's not our business. We can't afford the risk. Someone else will help. Yet while they wait, the world burns, floods, drowns. We must ask ourselves, individually and collectively, are we acting like the Californian? Are we waiting for comfort before we commit to compassion? In the dark waters of that April night, there was a ship full of people who saw signs of disaster and went back to bed. This ship lives on in our choices today. The SS Californian is not just a ship, it is a mirror. It asks, when others suffer, will we wait for morning? Or will we move in the night? The Titanic tragedy lives on not only in steel and water, but in the choices of those around it. The Californian teaches us that compassion delayed is compassion denied, and that doing nothing when you could do something is not neutrality but complicity. At approximately 12:45 a.m., on the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912, a quiet cargo passenger ship known as the SS Californian floated motionless among the ice fields of the North Atlantic. Her engines were off. Her wireless operator was asleep. Her captain, Stanley Lord, was in his cabin. Everything around was still save for the stars overhead and the distant, flickering bursts of light rising into the sky. Those bursts were not stars. They were distress rockets launched from the sinking RMS Titanic, a vessel 4 times the Californian size and home to more than 2,200 people, many of whom were about to meet their fate in the icy waters below. As Titanic floundered, taking on water, listing, breaking apart, and eventually slipping beneath the waves, its crew launched 8 white rockets into the night. A cry for help. A scream, not in sound but in light. On board the Californian, officers saw the lights. They reported them to Captain Lord. They wondered aloud what kind of ship would fire rockets like these. But no order was given to wake the wireless operator. No message was sent. No lifeboats were readied. No steam was raised. Instead, they waited. By the time the Californian reached the Titanic's last known position around 8:30 a.m., the sun was shining. The ocean was calm, and the tragedy had already played out. Met them was a harrowing silence and a sea filled with wreckage. Life jackets, deck chairs, floating trunks, bodies. Titanic had slipped beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m. A full 6 hours before the Californian's arrival. In that time, 1,569 lives had been lost, including that of Captain Edward Smith, engineers, musicians, mothers, children, millionaires, and emigrants. The ship that might have helped was close enough to watch it unfold, and yet did nothing. To this day, the Californian represents something more than mere maritime negligence. It has come to symbolize a deeper truth about human behavior, the tendency to help others only when it is safe, easy, and convenient. This behavior isn't just a flaw in leadership or a failure in judgment. It is a mirror held up to all of us, showing what happens when fear outweighs duty and when self-preservation erodes the moral imperative to act. Captain Lord defended his actions later by stating that it was unsafe to travel through ice in the dark. And while that may be logistically true, it misses the point. The ethical rot of the Californian story is not that it didn't act, but why it didn't. I tease the story of a ship that had every reason to act, the proximity, the awareness, the capacity, but made the choice to delay because the conditions weren't favorable. And in that choice lies the entire moral tragedy. We all know people like the Californian. They are the ones who say, "I'll help when I have time. I'll stand up when I'm not at risk. I'll care when it's easier. I'll speak when the noise dies down." In truth, these are not expressions of care, they are excuses for inaction. Delayed empathy is often disguised apathy. And convenient compassion, as symbolized by the Californian, is rarely compassion at all. We often assume that neutrality in a crisis is a form of wisdom, that staying out of trouble or not getting involved is somehow safer fare. But the Californian teaches a harsher lesson. Neutrality is a choice, and often it is the wrong one. When someone is in danger or when an injustice is unfolding before our eyes, there are no truly neutral positions. To stay silent is to permit. To delay is to enable. To turn away is to become a part of the tragedy, not by action, but by refusal. On the night of the Titanic's sinking, the Californian was not some distant observer. It was an active player, not because of what it did, but because of what it chose not to do. The haunting thing about the Californian is not that it failed to save everyone, that was likely impossible. The tragedy is that it might have saved many. Historians estimate that had the Californian steamed toward the Titanic when it saw the flares, even slowly, cautiously, it could have arrived before the ship slipped beneath the shore, or at least soon enough to rescue hundreds more from the freezing waters, long before hypothermia set in. Instead, the task of saving lives fell entirely to the Carpathia, a ship nearly 60 miles away. That ship sped through the ice at maximum capacity, arriving after the sinking but in time to rescue 710 survivors from lifeboats. The Carpathia took action in darkness. The Californian waited for light. One saved lives. The other arrived to witness death. In a world full of crisis, personal, societal, and global, the Californian is not just a historical ship, it is a metaphor for human reluctance. The friend who sees someone depressed but says, "I don't want to get involved." The colleague who notices harassment but stays silent, thinking, "Not my place." The government that sees famine but says, "It's too complicated right now." The family member who hears a cry for help but waits, saying, "Let's talk about it tomorrow." Each of these examples is a Californian moment, a scenario where help was possible, where awareness existed, but where help was withheld until it was too late. We like to believe we'd act differently, that we'd charge into the night like the Carpathia. But history and everyday life show us that most people act like the Californian. They hesitate, they justify, they rationalize, and then after the worst has happened, they regret. One of the most chilling aspects of the Californian's story is the aftermath. Once it became clear what had happened, that the Titanic had gone down and over 1,500 were dead, there was an outpouring of grief. Captain Lord tried to clear his name. Crew members felt a sense of shame. Maritime institutions changed their protocols. The world collectively mourned. But all of it was after the rockets, after the screams, after the cold, after the silence. This is what we might call retrospective empathy, the tendency to feel deeply once the opportunity to help has already passed. It is grief without usefulness, compassion without consequence. The world was moved by Titanic's tragedy, but the Californian reminds us that feeling sorry afterward is not the same as showing up when it counts. The question the Californian poses to every person is simple: what does it take for you to help? Do you need it to be easy? Do you need it to be risk-free? Do you need it to be scheduled at a convenient time? Do you need the suffering to be right at your doorstep? If the answer to any of those is yes, then the lesson of the Californian has not been learned. Because helping is rarely easy, rarely safe, and almost never convenient. That is why it is so powerful. The real heroes of April 15, 1912 were not the cautious or the silent. They were the ones who acted despite risk, despite distance, despite fear. They were not the ones who waited for light. They were the ones who moved through darkness.